In memory of W. Yeats. In memory of W. Yeats is a glorious tribute to the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats by English poet W. H. Auden. The poem is an elegy lamenting the irreparable loss of Yeats, who died on 29 January 1939. It shows life after death, the power of poetry, and the human condition. The poem is structured into three parts, further dividing into stanzas of different lengths. There are 63 lines in total. The first part of the poem pictures what it was like when Yeats died. The second is addressed to the poet himself, and the third is a much more traditional elegy. Okay, welcome to my YouTube channel Bachelor and Master English. Today, as you have already heard, we are talking about poem In Memory of W. Yeats by W. H. Auden. In our today's discussion, we will have the summary, critical appreciation, and finally there will be the exploration of the theme. So if you are new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe my channel, and if you think this video is worth visiting, please recommend your friend by sharing it. Let's know W. Yeats. This W. Yeats was born in 1865 and he was active in his poetry from 1889 to the time he passed away, or he breathed his last. He wrote a lot about the beauty of Ireland, and he is a romantic poet in this sense, and he wrote about love, his relation with Morgan and other ladies. And his contribution in that poetry romantic field, that makes him a great poet, and he won a Nobel Prize for his contribution in literature, especially drama, poetic drama, and he used naive tone unlike Auden. He also wrote about his political views. He was a member of the IRA, Irish Republican Army, and he was a role model to Auden. So why did W. H. Auden write poetry on W. Yeats? Why not others? So here the fundamental thing is that he was a role model to Auden, and he glorified the death of Yeats not as the loss but as the contribution and the way how people praise those who have lost life. So here is a summary of the poem. The poem is based on the great modern poet W. Yeats. It is written by W. H. Auden in a tributary form with a reflection on the foreshadowing events of World War II. The first part of the poem addresses the last days of Yeats' life and what it was like right after he died. Auden speaks on the loss and how it impacted and didn't impact the world. The second section of In Memory of W. Yeats is directed through a second person speaker to Yeats himself in the word form, while the third is an elegy meant to sum up that which was spoken about previously, but also make new statements about what poetry can do for humankind, especially in the face of Second World War. Our speaker embarks on an odyssey. He plans to offer us three variations on a traditional elegy, all of which glorify the life and works of the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, the W. Yeats of the title in the poem. Things start off simply enough. The speaker imagines what it must have been like for Yeats on the last day of his life, and the speaker begins the difficult process of imagining a world in which Yeats' poems will still exist even though their author is gone. The poem was written within 1 month of Yeats' death and published shortly thereafter. It has three distinct parts. Abruptly, the tone of the poem shifts. Suddenly, our speaker is addressing Yeats himself, chiding him for all of his mistakes but also admiring Yeats' poetry. In the second section of the poem, Yeats is called silly like us. It was mad Ireland that caused Yeats the suffering. It turned into poetry. Poetry survives and gives voice to the survival in a space of isolation. Auden painfully thinks that great poetry cannot correct the course of history. The futility of poetry in the material world is very clear. Poetry belongs to the spiritual world. It has nothing to do with the material world, but great poetry survives and continues to inspire because it comes out of sufferings of the poet. The third section of the poem is the last part of the poem. Here the poet asks the earth to receive Yeats as an honored guest. His body, emptied of its poetry, lies there. Finally, the poem lapses into an oh so traditional elegiac form. This doesn't last for long, though. Soon the speaker is up and running again, thinking about the problem of the here and now. It's 1939 and the world is on the brink of World War II to be exact. In other words, things aren't so happy right now, and the speaker isn't silly enough to think that poetry can bring world peace. The poem concludes with an impressive summing up of its achievement. Okay, this is all the summary. W.B. Yeatsको स्मृतिमा शीर्षकको कविता कवि W.H. ऑडेनले आयरल्यान्डेली कवि W.B. येट्सको सम्मानमा रचिएको एक भव्य र कालजयी रचना हो। सन् 1939मा भौतिक संसारबाट बिदा लिएका कवि येट्सको अवसानले सिर्जना गरेको अपूरणीय क्षतिप्रतिको यो शोक काव्य हो। तर यसमा उनले चाहिँ बिलौना भन्दा पनि यसलाई शोकलाई चाहिँ शक्तिको रूपमा परिणत गर्ने र शोकलाई चाहिँ प्रचार र चाहिँ उनले गरेको योगदानको चाहिँ पूर्व योगदानको चर्चा र उनका जुन कृतिहरू उनको भौतिक रूपमा अवसान भए पनि उनको बौद्धिक र साहित्यिक अवसान नभएको हुनाले त्यो साहित्यिक कृतिलाई चाहिँ अगाडि बढाउनु पर्ने, उनको साहित्यिक चर्चा झन् अघि बढाइदिनु पर्ने, उनको साहित्यले चाहिँ गरेको समाजप्रतिको चिन्तन, विश्वप्रतिको चिन्तन, मानवताप्रतिको चिन्तन, कला संस्कृति सबै प्रतिको चाहिँ विषयवस्तुलाई चाहिँ चर्चा गरिदिनुपर्छ भन्ने चाहिँ यहाँ जति चर्चा गरिन्छ, जति सम्मान अरूलाई गर्न सकिन्छ त्यो नै त्यो कविप्रतिको शोक उप्रतिको शोक भाव, शोक काव्य चाहिँ प्रकट भएको मानिन्छ। यसमा मृत्युपछि जीवन कविताको शक्ति र मानव अवस्थाको उजागर गरिएको छ। यो कविता 3 भागमा बाँडिएको छ। प्रत्येक भाग पनि अझ विभिन्न लम्बाइका अनुच्छेदमा विभाजित छन्। पहिलो अनुच्छेदमा येट्सको अवसान हुँदा कस्तो भयो भन्ने अवस्थाको चित्रण गरिएको छ। दोस्रो खण्डमा कवि स्वयंलाई सम्बोधन गरिएको छ र तेस्रो खण्ड भने पारम्परिक स्वयंभन्दा बढी बिलौना वा क्षतिलाई काव्य रचनातर्फ अग्रसर गराउन प्रयास गरेका छन्। येट्स को थिए त? उनी आयरल्यान्डका नागरिक थिए। उनले आयरल्यान्डको सुन्दरताको बारेमा धेरै लेखे। उनी स्वच्छन्दतावादी कवि थिए। उनले माया प्रेमको बारेमा लेखे अनि त्यसमा उनको भाव अझ जति ऑडेनको जति खारिएको थिएन। उनी आयरल्यान्डेली गणतान्त्रिक सेनाका सदस्य थिए। उनी ऑडेनको आदर्श नमुना कवि थिए। ऑडेनले यो कविता लेख्ने निधो किन गरे त? किनभने उनीहरू अमेरिका आएको 3 दिनपछि 73 वर्षको उमेरमा येट्सको मृत्यु भयो। ऑडेन जो अझै 32 वर्ष पुगेका थिएनन् त्यहाँ नयाँ मुलुकमा आफ्नो भविष्य सुरु गर्ने लक्ष्यका साथ बेलायत छोडेका थिए। येट्सको देहावसानमा उनले स्मरणीय र दुस्साहसी कविता लेखे जसले कविताको पुनर्जीवनको उद्घोष गरे। कविताको पुनर्जीवन होइन, कविको पनि पुनर्जीवनको उद्घोष गरेका छन्। मृत कविको स्मृतिमा लेखिएको शोक काव्यका अतिरिक्त यो कविता W.B. येट्सको स्मृतिमा एक चिन्तन गर्ने आधुनिक युगमा कविताको भूमिका र स्थानको बारेमा समेत थियो। यो कविता येट्सको बारेमा मात्रै नभई सबै कविहरूको बारेमा थियो जसको कविताले हामीलाई कसरी प्रशंसा गर्ने भन्ने कुरा सिकाउँछ। अर्कालाई प्रशंसा गर्न नजान्ने व्यक्तिले कुनै साहित्यको चर्चा गर्छु भन्ने अर्थै हुँदैन। यो क्षणिक चाहिँ आँसु खसालेर कसैको चाहिँ वेदनामा चाहिँ हार्दिक समवेदना अथवा हार्दिक श्रद्धाञ्जली भन्दैमा त्यो श्रद्धाञ्जली व्यक्त भएको हुँदैन। उसले गरेका योगदानहरूको राम्रो चर्चा गरिएको हुनुपर्छ। उसले गरेका चाहिँ कामहरूको, उसले गरेका सकारात्मक कामहरूको राम्रो चर्चा गरिनुपर्छ र नकारात्मक कामको सही मूल्याङ्कन गरिएको हुनुपर्छ। यसरी कसरी प्रशंसा गर्ने भन्ने कुरा सिकाउँछ। कवितामा अडेनले येट्सको मृत्युलाई शोकभन्दा पनि शोकलाई चाहिँ उत्सव, साहित्यिक उत्सवको रूपमा र प्रशंसाको रूपमा मनाउने नवशोक काव्यको सुरु गरेको पाइन्छ। यो नै हो कविताको नेपालीमा चर्चा। लेट्स टक अबाउट द क्रिटिकल एप्रिसिएसन अफ द पोएम। Along with his piece on the death of Sigmund Freud, Auden's tribute to the poet William Butler Yeats is a most memorable elegy on the death of a public figure. Written in 1940, it commemorates the death of the poet in 1939, a critical year for Auden personally as well as for the world at large. This was the year he moved to New York and the year the Second World War broke out. In Memory of W. Yeats by W. H. Auden is a modern poem in its imagery, concept and versification. The poem, as its title indicates, is an elegy written to mourn the death of W. Yeats, but it is different from the conventional elegy. Traditionally, in an elegy, all nature is represented as mourning the death. Here, nature is represented as going on its course, indifferent and unaffected, as we can see in Musée des Beaux-Arts. In part 1, Auden paints a dark, frozen, wintry landscape as the backdrop for its death. It is almost as if earth mourns his loss. All the animals, birds, forests, rivers, etc. were unaware of the magnitude of loss. After he is physically dead, its poems still live and are scattered across the world. The dead poet loses control over their meanings and over the kinds of affection they will excite. Auden refutes that one might try to measure the loss of Yeats with scientific instruments, but they can only tell one that the day of his death was a dark, cold day. He implies that Yeats had a value much greater than any instrument can measure. In part 2 of the ode, this poem is categorized as ode. Auden switches to Yeats' life and contrasts the man to his work. The man dies, but his poetry lives forever. Yeats' poetry survives its silliness and mysticism, his own physical decay, his insane country of Ireland, and even the damp and sometimes miserable Irish weather. Auden claims that poetry makes nothing happen in a practical sense, but that it survives in the human imagination. Far from the control of business executives, the poetry flows through imagination and unites humankind, which may be isolated, grief-stricken, and living in crude towns. Even though Yeats dies physically, he lives on in the imagination through his poetry. Part 3 is beautifully formal and rhetorical. Auden begins by directly addressing the earth into which Yeats will be placed. He instructs the earth to accept an honored guest, not a dead man. Auden explains that time, meaning history and chronological time, pardons poets and does not fully claim them, since it worships language and those who write it. It is the funeral, and the author invokes the earth to receive the body of William Butler Yeats and laments that Ireland is empty of its poetry. Time is villain who destroys the brave, the innocent and the beautiful, but loves the poet, and time forgives all the weaknesses, drawbacks and failures of the poet. In Memory of W. Yeats is a poem that presents W. Yeats as a man who had a substantial impact on his readers. The poet states that while Yeats' death was a tragic loss to the world, his impact lived on through the emotion invoked in his work. The 63-line poem is of course divided into stanza, but it is also broken into 3 sections, which is a more useful way to look at it. Traditionally, all elegies are in 3 sections: a lament for the dead, a section for praising the dead, and the section consoling the reader. Auden's poem follows this structure. Unkind traditional elegies, this poem urges us to think about its failings as well as his achievements. Perhaps the only way to express admiration is to do so honestly. So that's overall critical appreciation. Let's explore the theme in Memory of W. Yeats by W. Auden. There are different themes. The major theme is here death. Here, death becomes an occasion for Auden to reflect upon the complicated legacy Yeats left behind and the ways in which his work colored the 20th century poetic landscape. The second theme here is social validity of art or poetry. Poet dies physically, but his poetry lives forever. The poem presents the view that while art doesn't ever change anything, it offers a fresh perspective and makes us feel things about people and places that we might not spend. The theme is theme of isolation. Auden suggests that while poetry is not a cure-all, it can certainly help people see the truth of their situation, and even if it forces them to acknowledge their own loneliness. Okay, this is overall discussion in Memory of W. Yeats by W. H. Auden. Have a good day.